The proximity alarm on the Hermes orbital station sounded at 0317 hours Greenwich Mean Time, and Admiral Dr. Margaret Vance woke up before the second pulse of red light even swept across the polycarbonate visor of her quarters. 23 years of service had taught her body a reflex no military manual could encode. The difference between a system failure alarm and the alarm for something that simply should not be happening. This was the second kind. She was in the main corridor in 42 seconds, her gray hair still loose, her field uniform zipped to the very top. Hermes was a frontline monitoring station positioned on the outer edge of the Kepler system, 480,000 light-years from Earth. It was the silent sentinel of Kepler-7, the second successful human colony outside the solar system. 11,200,000 souls spread across 3 continents of a planet the early settlers had named, with touching simplicity, New Eden. Operations Command was a hive of activity when she entered. Terminals blinked relentlessly. Off-duty operators appeared at their stations, wearing expressions the Admiral had learned to read like a second language, that specific blend of confusion and dread that precedes the comprehension of something irreversible. "Report," she said, the words slicing through the ambient noise like a scalpel. Lieutenant Cormac Reynolds stood up from the sensor array so abruptly he knocked over his coffee, and no one in the room bent down to pick it up. That alone told the Admiral everything she needed to know about the gravity of the situation. "Admiral, we're detecting an unannounced warp exit 800 astronomical units from the planet. There's no record of any authorized vessel in this quadrant. The spectral emission sensors—" He hesitated, as if the words needed more space than his throat allowed. "The energy signature is Veth Anorum class." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Margaret counted them. The Veth Anorum, the hegemony of the 5 suns, the oldest active civilization registered in the galactic community, ruling uninterrupted for 42,000 years, possessing a fleet whose exact numbers had never been confirmed by any independent source, and whose propulsion technology predated the invention of human writing. The Veth Anorum, who had received the human diplomatic delegation 3 years prior with the condescension of a host inspecting a curious insect in their dining room. The Veth Anorum, who had referred to humanity in a public broadcast as the biological experiment yet to reach a definitive conclusion. "How many units?" Margaret asked. Her voice completely leveled, which was the most terrifying thing anyone on that crew had ever heard. 147 confirmed vessels, Admiral. Likely more completing warp exit beyond our primary sensor range. Kepler-7 had an orbital defense of 16 patrol ships and 2 Everest-class destroyers. It was enough to handle border pirates and mining disputes. It was the difference between a safety rail and a sheet of paper in front of a forest fire. "Establish a comm channel with Governor Sterling," Margaret said, "and wake Ambassador Hayes. I want every available diplomat on this station in active communication with the Veth delegation in less than 4 minutes. And someone get me the emergency channel to Earth." "Admiral," said the communications operator, Dr. Chloe Bennett, her voice low, "we are already receiving a broadcast from the Veth Anorum. It's broadband. They're broadcasting on all channels, including the open general use frequencies of the galactic community. Put it on screen." The central display of the Hermes lit up with the image of a Veth Anorum in a formal posture of authority. Nearly 8 feet tall, an exoskeletal body structure of polished dark amber, 3 pairs of compound eyes reflecting the cold ambient light of his flagship. Behind him, visible through the observation deck, the blue and green disk of Kepler-7 filled the frame like a flawless jewel in the void. He spoke. The Hermes Universal Translator, calibrated to galactic community standards, rendered the words in real time. "To the biological experiments designated as human, the hegemony of the 5 suns declares sovereignty over the star system catalogued under Index Veth 7 Gamma. The presence of your structures in this system constitutes territorial desecration. The solution will be demonstrative, broadcast to the other cataloged experiments as a lesson in natural hierarchy. There is no negotiation. There is no appeal. There is only the order of the cosmos. The transmission did not end there. It continued. And what came next was what transformed Margaret Vance at that specific moment of 0324 hours GMT into something different than she had been 41 seconds prior. The Veth Anarum cameras that, it became clear, had been pre-positioned on the planet's surface because the Veth had planned this well in advance, showed the cities of New Eden, cities with streets where children played during the day, cities with markets, schools, hospitals, cities sleeping beneath the planet's 3 moons in the early hours of the morning, completely ignorant of what had emerged from the shadows of space above them. The Veth fleet's plasma cannons began to fire. "Emergency channel to Earth, right now," Margaret said, but her voice came out differently this time. There was no fear in it. There was no despair. There was something much colder and much more permanent. "Earth responds in 18 minutes at best transmission speed, Admiral," Bennett said, tears streaming down the young operator's face. Tears she made no effort to hide. 18 minutes. Light traveled faster than any rescue humanity could send. What was happening on Kepler-7 would reach Earth as history, not as a present crisis. It would arrive as a fait accompli, broadcast live to every civilization in the galaxy. "Record everything," Margaret ordered. "Every second, every frequency, every camera angle they're using. I want maximum resolution. I want full metadata. I want every byte of this transmission preserved in triplicate on this station's redundant servers." She paused. "And I want Governor Sterling put on this channel immediately, while it's still possible." Governor Arthur Sterling's face appeared on the secondary monitor. He was in some underground bunker, obvious from the orange emergency lighting behind him. He was a 62-year-old man with the face of someone who had spent 3 decades building something and was now watching it topple, but his eyes were clear. "Admiral Vance," he said, with the formal dignity of a man who knew he was being recorded by history. "Governor Sterling, I am so deeply sorry." "I know you are." He took a deep breath. "Tell Earth that we were not afraid. Tell them that New Eden was built with dignity and that its children kept their heads held high." A pause. In the background, the distant sound of what the technical censor translation classified as a kinetic energy impact. "And tell them not to leave this debt unanswered, not because we seek revenge, Admiral, but because if the galaxy learns it can treat us this way without consequence, there will be no future for any of us anywhere in the universe." The governor's feed cut out 41 seconds later. Margaret Vance stood before the screens for another 2 minutes and 43 seconds, watching. She did not look away. She forced herself to watch, to engrave not just into the station's servers, but into the relentless memory of her own being everything that was happening on those screens, because she knew this moment required a witness who would not avert their eyes. When she finally turned back to her crew, there was something on her face that none of them had ever seen before, and that none of them would ever forget. "Begin preparing the atmospheric return module," she said. "I'm going to Earth, and someone get me some coffee, please. We have a long job ahead of us." It was the most human thing any of them could imagine saying at that moment. And that was exactly why Lieutenant Reynolds, his hand still shaking, went to get the coffee. The human delegation arrived at the Unified Galactic Council on Starvale Primarius 16 days after the Kepler-7 incident. Chief Ambassador William Hayes walked down the Council's entry corridor with his spine completely straight, a dossier of hollow projections tucked under his arm. Beside him walked Admiral Margaret Vance, who had insisted on being present despite holding no formal diplomatic title. No one questioned her presence. There was something in her posture that made questioning conceptually unviable. The main chamber of the Unified Galactic Council accommodated representatives of 48 distinct species. It was a monumental structure of symbiotic architecture, where each wing had been built to the gravitational and atmospheric standards required by each member civilization. The central dome, neutralized and pressurized to intersect physiological common denominators, was where the representatives gathered in plenary session. It was a place designed to symbolize that all voices carried equal weight beneath that translucent canopy displaying the star map of the visible universe in real time. William Hayes looked at the star map before speaking. He found Kepler 7. A completely ordinary star from a cosmic perspective. And then he began. He did not deliver a speech about grief. He did not appeal to emotion. Before becoming an ambassador, he had been an astrobiologist and a former professor of comparative logic, and he treated the council with the seriousness a professor affords students who haven't yet decided if they intend to learn anything. He presented the facts, the timeline, the coordinates, the sensor logs from Hermes, the Veth Anorum broadcast in all its 48 minutes. He presented the recorded testimony of Governor Sterling. He presented with flawless technical precision the demographic estimates of the number of civilians present on New Eden at the time of the Veth military action. Then he said, "Humanity requests 3 things from the Unified Galactic Council. First, formal recognition that what occurred on Kepler 7 constitutes a violation of the Meridian Border Accords signed by 62 parties, including the hegemony of the 5 suns. Second, the convening of a galactic tribunal for an independent investigation. Third, immediate diplomatic mediation to guarantee the security of remaining human systems while the investigation takes place." The ensuing silence had texture. William Hayes let it linger for a deliberately uncomfortable amount of time before sitting down. What happened over the next 3 hours was something Admiral Vance, in the only interview she ever granted about this day, described as the moment I fully understood the difference between a diplomatic system and a stage play for those who already hold the power. The Veth Anorum representative, not the same individual from the broadcast, but another, equally imposing, spoke for 40 minutes about historical precedents, about territorial jurisdiction based on ancestral discovery, about the difference between military action and what he called administrative border correction. His voice was modulated, his argument structurally elegant, and there was a subtext that every species in the chamber understood perfectly. The Veth Anorum had 42,000 years of galactic relations. They had alliances, favors granted, debts owed. They had helped found this very council. Humans had 140 years of confirmed space presence. The votes for each of the 3 human requests were conducted in order. The first, recognition of the violation, was rejected by 31 votes to 12, with 5 abstentions. The second, an independent tribunal, was rejected by 28 votes to 16. The third, security mediation, was approved by 35 votes to 8, with 5 abstentions. A small diplomatic victory that meant, in practice, the Council would send a formal monitoring report to the human solar system, a report on digital paper. William Hayes wrote down every number, every name, every species that had voted. The voting protocol was public, and he photographed the record with methodological precision. On their way out of the chamber, the representative of the Therax-Sul species, a mid-sized civilization with which humanity had maintained cordial relations for decades, approached Hayes in the corridor and spoke quietly through the universal translator. "Ambassador, I regret today's outcome. There were pressures that you will understand were not under my control." "I understand perfectly," Hayes said, with a courtesy that was neither cold nor warm, merely exact. "And I also understand that every decision made today has been recorded." The Therac representative hesitated. "Do you plan any diplomatic retaliation?" Hayes considered the question for a moment. "We are in the process of strategic redefinition," he finally said. "Have a good day." On the shuttle back to the human ship, Margaret Vance stood by the observation window, looking out into space as Starvale Primarius shrank in the background. William Hayes sat beside her, the hollow projection folder still closed on his lap. "They expected us to cry," Margaret said, without looking away from the stars. "Or to threaten them," Hayes replied. "Some reaction they could catalog and manage within the system they control. We are going to give them something completely different." Hayes opened his folder and began typing. "I've already started drafting the memo for the cabinet. Proposal for full economic redirection. We need 60% of the global GDP allocated to defense technology development over the next 12 months, with emergency parliamentary approval." He paused. "Margaret, how many ships can Earth build in a year, if we remove all budgetary limits?" Margaret Vance finally turned away from the window and looked at him with those eyes that had watched Kepler 7 without blinking. "It's not about ships," she said. "At least, not just about ships. It's about what we do with them. It's about the message." She sat down. "The galaxy doesn't understand tears. It understands consequence. We need a year to build not just power, but the surgical precision of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and why." A pause. "And we need silence. No non-essential communication with the Council. No statements. No responding to diplomatic provocations. Total silence for exactly 1 year." Hayes considered it. "They'll interpret it as weakness. Let them." They traveled back to Earth in silence, each lost in their own calculations about what came next. What neither of them knew yet was that the Veth Anorum broadcast, that cruel spectacle beamed broadband to the entire galactic community, had triggered a consequence the Veth hadn't anticipated. It had reached every planet, every orbital station, every ship in transit. And it had also reached the screens of the scientists at the Advanced Research Division at MIT, where Professor Dr. Emily Carter watched the broadcast alongside her team of 23 researchers, and then, without saying a word, walked to the whiteboard in her office and began writing equations. Shutterstock. The equations detailed a toroidal geometry force field she had theorized 7 years ago, but had never received funding to develop because no one could imagine a practical application urgent enough to justify the cost. Now there was one. She worked for 18 hours straight, stopping only to consume the 3 daily liters of coffee her team had learned to treat as being as fundamental to her physiology as oxygen. When she finished, the equation on the whiteboard was a thing of haunting elegance, and what it described would make any ship that utilized it capable of absorbing the specific type of plasma discharge the Veth Anorum cannons used as their primary armament. It was the beginning of what history would come to call the Year of Silence. And it was also the beginning of something the Veth Anorum, in their 42 millennia of arrogance, had forgotten to calculate. What happens when you push a species that has spent its entire existence learning to survive impossible conditions, and finally give them a reason big enough to stop merely surviving and start building, with all the accumulated determination of their history, something absolutely new? Earth made no statements. It did not respond to the minor Veth diplomatic provocations in the months that followed. It sent no ambassadors to the Council. It simply worked in silence, with a concentration that, to any outside observer who knew how to recognize the pattern, was identical to the expression of a human being who has finally decided, once and for all, to solve a problem. Chief Engineer Thomas Wright hadn't slept in 36 hours when the Advanced Propulsion Consortium at the Artemis Lunar Station finally produced the result he had spent 8 months chasing. It was 4:45 a.m. Houston time. Not that it mattered much 2 meters below the surface of the moon, where Artemis operated on work cycles dictated by efficiency rather than the sun, and Wright was on his knees on the lab floor, surrounded by components of a modified antimatter engine that his critics, 6 months prior, had called physically impossible to stabilize in a vessel of the proposed size. The engine was running, and not just running. It was operating at 142% of its originally projected efficiency, meaning the ships equipped with it would reach the required warp speed in less than half the time any previous human technology demanded. "Dr. Wright," said research assistant Sophie Evans, "telemetry data is confirmed across all 7 monitoring stations." Wright stood up slowly, held out his hand, and Sophie placed a cup of coffee in it. He drank the pitch-black, sugarless liquid continuously, in 3 long gulps. Caffeine was one of the multiple aspects of human biology that continued to fascinate and disturb the xenobiologists of other species. A systemic dependence on a stimulant that was mildly toxic to most carbon-based organisms known in the galaxy, voluntarily administered in increasing quantities during moments of maximum stress. The biological logic was the opposite of what any rational species would design for itself, and yet it produced results the data couldn't ignore. "Send the report to Admiral Vance," Wright said, and his tone carried the specific satisfaction of a man who had just proven that something impossible was merely improbable if you didn't work hard enough. "And get me more coffee." The report reached Admiral Vance's desk at 5:02 a.m. She read it once, start to finish, and then read it again. Then she opened a secure channel to Ambassador Hayes in Geneva. "We have the engine," she said. "And the shields?" Hayes asked. "Carter sent the functional prototypes 3 weeks ago. We are integrating them into the hulls of the 1st Division. Is the Black Division ready?" Margaret Vance looked out the window of her Washington, D.C. office at the dawn sky, where the blue had not yet fully decided to overwrite the black, making it both colors at once, in transition, like everything else at that moment. "In 46 days, she said. The 46 days passed with the precision of a stopwatch calibrated to permit no form of delay. The Black Division, an internal name, never spoken on any channel not encrypted with the quantum key technology developed specifically for this project, was comprised of 2,308 warships of 5 different classes. Each one was built with the singular purpose of operating cohesively, with a response speed that exceeded the military standards of any other cataloged civilization in the galactic community. The design principle was simple. There was no ship in the Black Division that could not be operated by an emergency crew of just 3 people. Wright had insisted, during a heated meeting with the consortium's naval engineers, that a ship relying on its full crew to operate is a ship that will fail at the most critical moment. The onboard automation of each vessel was managed by artificial intelligence systems developed by Dr. Rachel Brooks's team at Oxford University, who had spent the last 9 months creating what she called Sirius, System for Intelligent Response and Integration of Universal Strategies. Sirius was not a general AI. It was deliberately specialized, designed to coordinate fleet tactics with a processing speed that made ship-to-ship battle communication obsolete. Every Sirius on every ship shared information with all the others in milliseconds. In battle, the Black Division would think as a single organism. Admiral Vance spent 3 weeks visiting every ship class. She spoke with every commander. She memorized names, not out of protocol, but because of who she was. Someone who believed no one should deploy anywhere without having looked into the eyes of the person ordering the deployment. On one of these visits, aboard the star carrier Kepler's Promise, named deliberately in memory of the lost planet, she found Commander Jack Mitchell personally verifying the calibration of the onboard sensors from the cockpit itself, kneeling in the access bay, tools in hand. "Commander," she said, in a tone that wasn't critical, just curious. Mitchell looked up without embarrassment. "Admiral, the sensor tech is down with the flu. Figured it was faster to check it myself than wait for a stand-in." He paused. The calibration was 1.5 degrees off optimal. Margaret watched in silence for a moment. "You know how to operate the sensors of a flagship?" "I know how to operate all critical systems of every ship in this division," Mitchell stated with the simplicity of someone reporting a fact. I insisted all commanders in this fleet do the same. If the crew goes down, the mission can't go down with them." Margaret Vance nodded slowly. It was exactly this kind of thing that made it impossible to explain to any alien species what a human military force actually was when it was truly motivated. It wasn't just the technology. It wasn't just the sheer number of ships. It was that. A flagship commander, on his knees in an access bay, calibrating sensors with his bare hands because the job needed to be done, and he was there to do it. On the 39th day, a broadcast arrived from the Galactic Council. Routinely, formally, it was an update on the monitoring protocol promised months ago. In practice, it was a series of probing questions about what humanity was building in the lunar docks and on the dark side of Mars, as species with sufficient sensor capabilities had detected unprecedented construction activity, and the question had begun circulating in the halls of the Council. William Hayes responded with a single paragraph on the 29th day after receiving it. Humanity appreciates the Council's interest in its infrastructure activities. As established by the Systemic Sovereignty Accords of Kepler Prime, Article 17, subsection 3, no member civilization is obligated to declare in advance the purpose or scale of construction projects conducted within the limits of its home system. We remain committed to galactic peace and look forward to discussing any remaining issues in a formal council session at a date of our convenience. The phrase, "at a date of our convenience," circulated among the council representatives for days. On the 46th day, the Black Division left the docks. There was no ceremony. There was no public speech. There was no live broadcast. 308 state-of-the-art warships equipped with Wright's engine, Carter's shields, and Brooks' Sirius systems simply departed the solar system in a coordinated warp formation. The departure created an energy signature visible on long-range sensors across the entire galaxy. No one needed to give a speech. The energy signature said everything that needed to be said. On Starvale Primarius, the representative of the Gor-Temash species, who had voted against all 3 human requests months earlier, urgently called an emergency meeting with his domestic council and spoke 6 words his biographers would later identify as the moment galactic politics shifted on its axis. Perhaps we have made a mistake. In the silent chamber of the Galactic Council, the Vethanorum representative received the intelligence report on the Black Division, read the sensor data of the departure, and stood motionless for a period of time his subordinates later described as unusual. Then he said quietly, strictly to the interpreter beside him, "What exact size fleet has a species with 140 years of space history managed to build in a single year?" The interpreter consulted the sensor data. "Our current estimate is 2,300 ships, Excellency. But the energy emission data suggests the propulsion technology is uncatalogued." The Veth representative fell silent again, and then he said something his biographers never confirmed, but which multiple secondary sources attributed to him, roughly translating to, "Let us not underestimate what we do not understand." It was too late for that advice, of course. The Black Division was already in warp, and Commander Mitchell, in the cockpit of the Kepler's Promise, had his sensors calibrated exactly 1.5 degrees above the minimum requirement, which was right where he wanted them. The Black Division dropped out of warp 320 astronomical units from the Veth Anorum home system at 14:33 hours GMT, exactly 365 days after the massacre of Kepler 7. The first signal the Veth monitoring systems registered was the energy signature of 2,308 simultaneous warp exits, something Veth defense physicists, analyzing the data in the following minutes, deemed technically impossible within the known parameters of any existing propulsion system. Impossible was, notoriously, a relative concept. Commander Mitchell opened the fleet channel. In every ship, in every cockpit, at every ops station, the commander's voice came through crystal clear, processed by the quantum communication systems Engineer Wright had prioritized. "Black Division, this is Mitchell aboard the Kepler's Promise. We are in position. Confirm system status." The confirmations rolled in, sequenced and processed by the onboard Sirius, cascading down the tactical display in green. 2,307 confirmations. The remaining ship, the Meridian-class destroyer named New Eden, hadn't confirmed yet. Mitchell waited the protocol-mandated 3 seconds before repeating the hail. New Eden, confirm status. The voice that answered belonged to a young lieutenant named Amelia Foster. There was something peculiar in her tone, a firmness that wasn't military, but rather something more fundamental. Mitchell recognized it, because he had felt the exact same thing in himself when he learned this mission would be the one to open the Veth home system. New Eden confirms full status, Commander. All systems operational. We are ready. Mitchell logged the confirmation and returned to his panel. The mission had been planned in 4 phases. Phase 1 was the one no official communique had named directly, but which everyone in the division understood. Demonstration of presence and capability. Approach the Veth home system in an open formation, without attempting to mask the energy signature, without evasive maneuvers. Show up, be seen. Let the fleet's sensor data be received and processed. The logic was both psychological and strategic. A fleet arriving in stealth mode is a fleet attacking by surprise. A fleet arriving in a massive open formation, allowing all its systems to be detected and cataloged, was sending a different message. We are here. We know you know we are here. And we feel absolutely no need to hide. It was a posture the galactic community had never seen before, counterintuitive under any paradigm of conventional warfare. But it wasn't counterintuitive to anyone who had studied, as Admiral Vance had over 12 months of preparation, human historical patterns of conflict resolution. Over millennia of terrestrial history, humanity had developed a series of behaviors its sociologists termed costly signaling, actions demonstrating commitment through their inherent risk and cost. Arriving with a highly visible fleet was a costly signal. It meant, we are confident enough in our capability that we do not need the advantage of surprise. The hegemony of the Five Suns responded 42 minutes later with the warp exit of its own interior defense fleet. 378 warships of ancestral combat architecture, technology refined over centuries, manned by warriors who had fought in dozens of military campaigns across their long galactic history. Mitchell looked at the sensor data. The numerical disparity was 6-1 in favor of the Black Division. But numbers weren't the only thing that mattered. It was what the electromagnetic field sensors were reading off the Veth hulls. Their defensive architecture was designed for a specific type of accelerated plasma that had been the standard weaponry of all galactic civilizations for the last 2,000 years. Carter's shields weren't just highly resistant to Veth cannons. They were specifically calibrated for that exact emission, like a key forged for a very particular lock. Sirius, Mitchell addressed the onboard AI. Calculate the probability of success in an open engagement with the Veth defense fleet in their current configuration. Sirius replied in 0.3 seconds, 94.7% success probability, with an estimated loss of 18 to 32 Allied vessels, depending on tactical variables. Margin of error, 2%. Mitchell registered the number, 18 to 32 ships, each ship with a minimum crew of 3 and a maximum of 40. He didn't convert those numbers into people, because doing so would compromise his focus for the second phase of the plan, and he was honest enough with himself to know that was the grim calculus of command. The Veth transmission arrived on an open channel, unencrypted, clearly directed at the entire human fleet, and intentionally broadcast on a frequency the broader galactic community could monitor. Unidentified vessels operating in unauthorized proximity to the Vethanorum home system. Withdraw immediately or you will be engaged as an invasion force under Systemic Sovereignty Protocols. Article 6. Mitchell activated the response channel. This is Commander Jack Mitchell of the United Human Space Force Black Division aboard the Kepler's Promise. We are transmitting on an open channel. available to all quadrants of the galactic community. He paused for a beat. We inform the hegemony of the Five Suns that this fleet is positioned at international coordinates, 320 astronomical units from your home system, in neutral galactic space as defined by the Meridian Accords, Article 3. We do not constitute an invasion force. We are a delegation. There was silence for 90 seconds. Mitchell easily pictured the debates erupting on the Veth bridges opposite his fleet. There was a grim satisfaction in the image. The Veth reply came from a new voice, more senior, judging by the modulation pattern. Human delegation. The hegemony does not receive armed military delegations. With all due respect, Mitchell countered, the hegemony broadcast the massacre of 11,200,000 people to the entire galaxy, as if it were entertainment. Humanity determined that the current diplomatic context demands our delegations arrive appropriately equipped. A calculated pause. We propose direct contact between Admiral Margaret Vance and the leadership of the hegemony, in person, aboard a neutral vessel of mutual choosing, for discussion. The ensuing silence lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Mitchell counted every single one of them. What kind of discussion? The Veth voice finally asked. And it was here, in the historical records that followed, where military analysts from dozens of civilizations spent decades debating the genius or the sheer audacity, some argued there was no difference, of what Admiral Vance had planned for this specific moment. Reparations, Mitchell said, and the terms of the new galactic order. What he didn't say, and what the open channel transmission guaranteed the entire galaxy heard, was that humanity had not arrived to attack. They had arrived to negotiate, with 2,308 warships positioned in neutral space, boasting technology that Veth sensor data clearly indicated was uncatalogued and potentially superior. Humanity had arrived to sit at the table. By galactic tactical standards, this was entirely unprecedented. And it was precisely that unprecedented nature that compelled the senior representative of the Veth fleet to authorize contact. Aboard the Kepler's Promise, far from the main cockpit, in the small break room behind the navigation bay, Lieutenant Amelia Foster sat holding a holographic photograph. It was a family, 2 adults and 3 children in a park that, judging by the foliage and the sky with 2 visible moons, was unmistakably on Kepler 7. Communications Lieutenant Michael Shaw walked past the corridor and spotted her. He said nothing for a moment. Then he spoke softly. Your family? My sister, Foster said without looking up. And her kids. Shaw nodded. There were dozens of stories like that in the Black Division. It was part of the reason the cabinet hadn't needed much convincing to approve voluntary recruitment. There were enough people with personal stakes, and enough people without any direct link to Kepler 7 who simply understood what was on the line for humanity as a whole. The Admiral said if there was an alternative to fighting, we'd find it first, Shaw said. Do you believe that? Shaw considered the question seriously, which was the only way it deserved to be considered. I believe the Admiral will genuinely try, he said. And I also believe that if it doesn't work out, we're right here. Foster put the photograph away. She stood up and walked back to her station. The Kepler's Promise held its position, its sensors recording everything. The chosen neutral vessel was the Concordia, a galactic mediation capsule station belonging to the Free Navigation Consortium of the Polarivos species, a small civilization whose only consistent political stance over 4 centuries had been absolute neutrality in any conflict not directly involving their home system. The Polarivos were, essentially, the galaxy's experts at not taking sides, making them universally acceptable hosts for situations where anyone else would be automatically suspect. Admiral Margaret Vance arrived at the Concordia accompanied by 3 people, Ambassador William Hayes, Dr. Emily Carter, whose presence had been heavily debated internally until Vance simply declared, "She's coming because I decide who comes," ending the debate, and Lieutenant Commander James Holden serving as the protocol officer. Holden's most relevant contribution in the preceding days had been producing, in 4 hours of uninterrupted work, a 97-page document cataloging every single violation of the Meridian Accords committed by the Veth Anorum over the last 300 years, complete with primary sources and cross-references. The Veth Anorum delegation consisted of 7 individuals, all of high hierarchy, all carrying themselves with the kind of bearing that 42,000 years of accumulated power bestows upon a civilization. Lord Hegemon Vreth Ansor, the supreme executive authority of the hegemony of the 5 suns, was a being whose appearance human cultural translators classified as designed to intimidate. Nearly 10 feet tall, an almost black amber exoskeleton, 6 deep golden compound eyes, and every movement executed with a precision proving each gesture had been rehearsed over decades of protocol. Margaret Vance was 5'6", had gray hair, and had downed 3 cups of coffee before entering the mediation chamber because that was what she did before any important meeting, and she saw no reason to change the habit now. They met around an elliptical table designed to accommodate diverse anatomies in the center of the Concordia's mediation chamber. A translucent Polarivos force field subtly separated the atmospheres of each delegation for physiological comfort. The air on the human side smelled faintly of coffee, a fact Dr. Carter noted with a degree of satisfaction likely disproportionate to the circumstances. Lord Hegemon Vreth Ansor spoke first. As Veth Anorum protocol dictated that the party with the greatest civilizational seniority initiate all diplomatic encounters. None of the humans present objected to this convention. Hayes had determined during prep that picking protocol battles before the real fight began was a waste of energy they might need later. The presence of the human fleet in proximity to the Veth home system constitutes an act of provocation, Vreth Ansor stated through the universal translator. The hegemony demands its immediate withdrawal before any discussion of merit can occur. With respect to the Lord Hegemon, Admiral Vance said, in a tone that was completely courteous and utterly immovable, the Black Division remains exactly where it is for the duration of negotiations, as a security condition for the human delegation. This condition is non-negotiable. Vreth Ansor remained utterly still for 4 seconds, a long time for his species, the functional equivalent of a look of utter astonishment. "You negotiate with your fleet as a hostage?" he asked, a subtle edge to his voice that wasn't exactly indignation, but something adjacent to it. "We negotiate with our fleet as a guarantee of good faith," Hayes corrected. An important distinction. Vance activated the holo projector in front of her, projecting Holden's document onto the table. 97 pages, 3 centuries of data. "This document," she said, "catalogs every incident of the hegemony violating the Meridian Accord since 2289, cross-referenced with diplomatic communications, censor logs, and third-party testimonies. It includes 42 pre-Kepler 7 incidents affecting minor civilizations, handled by the Galactic Council with the exact same inaction we witnessed when we submitted our own requests." She paused. "We aren't just here about Kepler 7. We are here about a pattern." Vreth Ansor looked at the holographic document. His 6 eyes tracked across the data with a speed suggesting the Veth species processed visual information far faster than humans. It took him 48 seconds to review a representative sample of the contents. "These incidents were resolved diplomatically," he stated. "They were closed diplomatically," Holden interjected, speaking for the first time. "There is a difference. Closing an incident means it stopped occurring. Resolving an incident means its root causes were addressed and its victims received acknowledgement and restitution. None of the 42 prior incidents in this document had a resolution, only a closure." Vreth Ansor looked at Holden with an expression the human delegation's facial analysis software, running discreetly on Hayes's wrist device, classified as recalibrating perception of interlocutor. The Lord Hegemon had, in all likelihood, assumed the lowest-ranking officer at the human table would be the least relevant. It was an understandable cultural modeling error, given that Veth Anoram hierarchy was rigidly linear. "What exactly does the human delegation propose?" Vreth Ansor asked, a slight but perceptible adjustment in his voice. Less declarative, slightly more inquisitive. Vance exchanged a brief glance with Hayes. This was the moment they had worked 12 months for. "3 items," she said. "First, formal recognition by the hegemony of the 5 suns that the action on Kepler-7 constitutes a violation of the Meridian Accords. A public declaration, broadcast broadband to the galactic community in the exact same manner the action itself was broadcast." She let that settle before continuing. "Second, economic reparations equivalent to the construction cost of a new human colony matching Kepler-7's capacity in a location to be determined by humanity, with all necessary infrastructure to house its 11 million displaced inhabitants. Dr. Carter has the technical calculations for this." Carter opened her own holographic panel, projecting a towering column of engineering specs. It was a 230-page document. The doctor had spent 2 months preparing it, and in Lieutenant Commander Holden's estimation, having proofread every page, it was the most painstakingly detailed thing he had ever read in his life. "And the third item?" Vreth Ansor asked. "Structural reform of the Meridian Accords," Hayes said, "including the creation of an enforcement mechanism with actual executive power. A galactic tribunal with the authority to impose economic and mobility sanctions on signatories who violate the terms. With rotating composition among all member civilizations, including the minor ones, and with proportional representation not based solely on civilizational seniority." The silence that followed was the longest since the meeting began. Vreth Ansor remained completely motionless for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, an eternity in any species' diplomatic protocol. Then he said something in Veth Anoram that the universal translator rendered as, "You propose reforming the galactic system your species has barely entered." "We propose," Vance said calmly, "reforming a system that has demonstrated publicly and irrefutably to be insufficient in protecting any of its minor members from actions like the one that victimized Kepler-7. Including eventually the hegemony of the 5 suns itself, should the balance of power shift in the coming decades." A pause. "The galaxy is bigger than any single species, Lord Hegemon. Humanity learned that in a way we would have preferred not to." Vreth Ansor looked at her for a long moment. "You came with your fleet," he said, "but you propose peace. We came with our fleet because the last time we arrived with just words, 11 million people died," Vance replied. "The fleet isn't a threat, it's context. A reminder that this conversation is taking place between parties who mutually recognize each other as capable of real consequences." She tilted her head slightly. "That is, in fact, the prerequisite for any genuine negotiation. The hegemony knows this. It is the context in which you have operated for 42,000 years." The meeting lasted another 11 hours. At Aero 312 hours the next day, Lord Hegemon Vreth Ansor and Admiral Margaret Vance signed the document that would come to be known as the Kepler Accords, a 43-page compendium that included the 3 items proposed by the human delegation, 2 addendums suggested by the Veth delegation, which were, to Hayes' surprise, genuine contributions and not attempts at dilution, and an implementation protocol with a 12-month timeline overseen by observers from the 7 most historically credible neutral galactic species. Carter, who had been awake for 32 hours by this point, drank her 10th cup of coffee as the documents were formalized. The Polarivos, serving as the Concordia's official mediator, an ethereal-looking being most xenobiologists classified as vaguely fungiform, had observed the human delegation with growing fascination over the 11 hours of negotiation. As Carter finished her coffee, the mediator discreetly approached her and asked through the translator, with the genuine curiosity of someone witnessing something that defied existing categories. "This substance you consume continuously, what is its function?" "Coffee," Carter said. "It's mildly toxic and absolutely essential." The mediator processed this for a moment. "Is this characteristic of your species?" he asked. Carter considered the question seriously. "Yes," she said. "I think it's quite characteristic." In the mediation chamber, Vance folded the Kepler Accords and tucked them under her arm. She wasn't exactly smiling, but her face bore the expression of someone who had carried a crushing weight for so long that its sudden absence created a strange, almost disorienting lightness. She opened the comm channel to the Kepler's promise. "Mitchell. Admiral. The Accords are signed. Prepare the return formation." A pause. Then, "Copy that, Admiral. With pleasure." The Black Division returned to the solar system in an open formation, just as it had departed. No subterfuge, no stealth maneuvers, every energy signature burning bright for any sensor system with enough range to see. The return trip took 4 days at a reduced warp speed, because Admiral Vance had determined there was no reason to rush, and every reason to give the galactic community time to process what had just happened. The Black Division's comm channel remained relatively silent over those 4 days. There was no formal celebration, no grand announcements. Within that specific silence, there was a different quality than the silence of the prior year. This was a silence of sheer exhaustion, of thoughts that finally needed space to settle. On the 3rd day of the return voyage, Admiral Vance called an all-hands meeting for the commanders via holo projection. 238 faces in a grid of luminous panels broadcasting from every corner of the Black Division. She looked at them for a moment before speaking. "First and foremost," she said, "I want to acknowledge what every one of you has carried, not just over the last few days, but over the last year. You built something on a timeline any historical standard would call impossible, with a purpose few of you chose lightly." She paused. "The Kepler Accords are a beginning, not a conclusion. It is vital you understand that. What we signed is a framework, and frameworks are only ever as good as the people who inhabit them over time." Commander Mitchell, whose face occupied the top center of the grid by hierarchical protocol, asked, "And if the hegemony fails to honor the terms?" "Then we will have another conversation," Vance said. "With the exact same tone of voice we used this time. The Black Division does not dissolve. It exists, from this day forward, as a permanent reality of human capability." A pause. "But I sincerely hope we are not needed. The alternative to being needed is a universe where the rules actually work. I prefer that universe." There was a question no one was asking directly, but which Vance could read on the faces in the grid, especially the younger ones. She decided it was better if she was the one to ask it out loud. "Some of you are wondering if we did the right thing," she said. "If negotiating was a sign of weakness, given what happened on Kepler 7. If 11 million people deserved more than treaties and reparations." Silence on the grid. "The honest answer is that I don't know," Margaret Vance said. "I know the hegemony will sign a public recognition of its actions. I know New Eden will be rebuilt. I know the mechanisms that allowed the Galactic Council to stand by while our citizens died will be reformed. Whether that is enough is a question each of you will have to answer for yourselves in different ways over time, and I respect that." She closed the channel. In the quiet space of her cockpit, alone for a moment, Margaret Vance opened her desk drawer and pulled out something small. A photograph printed on actual paper, not a hologram. It was the only paper photograph she had brought with her. It was an aerial view of New Eden, Kepler 7, as it was known before the colonists arrived, and gave it a more human name. The planet seen from low orbit, blue and green and vibrantly alive, with its 3 moons aligned in the upper right corner of the frame like punctuation in a sentence the universe was writing. She looked at the photograph long enough to memorize it with the precision of an archive, and then put it back in the drawer. The Unified Galactic Council broadcast a formal declaration 48 hours after the signing of the Kepler Accords. It was a carefully crafted statement, utilizing the polished vernacular diplomats of 48 civilizations spend generations refining, but the content was unprecedented. The Council recognized the Kepler Accords as a binding treaty under galactic law and announced the immediate formation of a reform committee for the Meridian Accords. For the first time in Council history, the committee's composition included representatives of 10 minor civilizations that had previously only held non-voting observer status. The representative of the Tharaxul species, the one who had spoken to Hayes in the Council corridors months ago, sent a direct single-line communication to Ambassador Hayes. "I said there were pressures. I am glad they have shifted." Hayes responded with 2 paragraphs of diplomatic courtesy that essentially translated to, "I understand, and I will keep that in mind." 5 months after the Black Division's return, the first construction crews broke ground on what would be called Nova Kepler, a star system identified 120 light-years from Earth, boasting a habitable planet with characteristics mirroring Kepler-7. The terraforming and colonial construction specs had been meticulously produced by Dr. Carter. The survivors of Kepler-7, those who had escaped in emergency evacuation pods in the opening minutes of the attack, those who had been off-world for work or study, those who simply survived for the random, inscrutable reasons some live when others do not, were granted absolute priority for resettlement. The hegemony of the 5 Suns bankrolled the construction exactly to Carter's terms, and the delivery schedule was made public so the entire galactic community could verify compliance. Lieutenant Amelia Foster requested a transfer to the Nova Kepler construction team. Her request was approved within 24 hours. She spent the next 3 years working as a logistics coordination officer, building the new planet's first cities. In a photograph taken on the day the first wave of Kepler-7 survivors disembarked onto new soil, she stands in the background, out of the main frame, looking not at the camera, but at the children walking down the boarding ramp to step onto fresh Earth for the first time. Her expression is hard to classify. It isn't simple joy. It's something vastly more complex, layered, like most true things are. Engineer Thomas Wright received the Applied Science Award from the Human Technological Advancement Consortium. He used his acceptance speech to announce, without prior warning and to the shock of everyone present, that his next line of research would focus on propulsion systems for deep space civilian exploration vessels. "We built things for war because we had to," he said, in a speech journalists noted was surprisingly brief, given the magnitude of the award. "Now, we're going to build for the rest of the reason we went to space in the first place." Dr. Emily Carter returned to MIT and spent 6 months writing a book on terraforming engineering that became the standard reference text in 12 civilizations across the galactic community, translated into 43 languages, including Veth Anorum. On the final page of the book, past all the equations, data, and technical specs, there was a single paragraph that the Veth Anorum translator struggled to render accurately. Because its emotional architecture relied on concepts, the Veth language simply had no words to express directly. Every colony begins with people who decided the horizon was worth the effort, that the distance between where we are and where we could be is exactly the size of a dream not yet built. That is what humans do. We arrive, we plant, we build, and when what we built is taken from us, we build again. Not because we are invincible, because we do not know how to stop trying. It is a character flaw we have no intention of correcting. Ambassador William Hayes presided over the first session of the newly reformed Galactic Tribunal 11 months after the Kepler Accords. The very first case the tribunal heard did not involve humans. It was a territorial dispute between 2 minor civilizations in the outer quadrant that had been trying to submit their conflict to the Galactic Council for decades without result. The tribunal resolved the case in 40 days, reaching a decisive merit that both parties accepted as fair. It was a modest start. Arguably, it was the kind of start that had the best chance of lasting. And Admiral Margaret Vance, 1 year and 6 months after the Kepler Accords, went to the Wall of Names. The wall was a structure proposed by a group of Kepler-7 survivors and built by volunteers on a plateau of one of Mars's moons, a place with enough gravity to walk comfortably, but high enough that the sky remained a deep, piercing black, even during the lunar day. It was forged from a metallic alloy compound developed by Wright's team, highly resistant to radiation and temperature, designed to last what geologists calculated to be a minimum of 10,000 years. Etched into its polished surface, in small, uniform letters, were the names of every person documented as present on Kepler-7 on the day of the attack. 11,243,608 names. Margaret walked the length of the wall unhurriedly, hands clasped behind her back, in the filtered vacuum silence of her pressure suit, the sound of her own breathing the only noise in existence. She wasn't looking for a specific name, not this time. She was simply reading them at random, letting the names settle over her like something that required gravity to be carried properly. There were names from all over Earth, names belonging to every language humanity had ever invented. There were short names and long names, names with apostrophes and hyphens, names that were words with deep meaning, and names that were pure sound without direct translation. They were the names of people who had woken up that day, drank their morning coffee, taken their kids to school, argued with their spouses over things both trivial and important, and who had, within a matter of hours, ceased to exist for reasons devoid of any measure of logic or justice. Margaret Vance stood before the wall for a very long time. When she finally turned back to leave, there was something in her expression that the few technicians present in the wall's maintenance area, watching from a distance, couldn't clearly read. It was possible that it was peace, but it was the kind of peace that doesn't erase what preceded it. It simply finds a place to coexist with it. She walked back to her transport ship. The galaxy continued out there, with all its vast expanse, all its mysteries, and all the other civilizations that inhabited it, each with their own history of loss, survival, and reconstruction. And humanity was out there too, in its colonies, its exploration ships, its laboratories, schools, and markets, doing what it had always done with the peculiar persistence of a species that simply hadn't learned how to give up. It was, from the perspective of any observer with enough patience to see the full arc of things, somewhere between a flaw and a virtue, and it was unequivocally, entirely theirs. End of story. If the tenacity of the human crew inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more chronicles from the galactic frontier. Because in the vastness of the cosmos, the most unlikely story is still being written, and it always begins with someone who decided to never stop trying.